Welcome back to another episode of the RockFit Files. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, I have Simon Ward from the UK coming on the show. He has not only been doing triathlons, competing in them since the 80s, he's been coaching them since the mid-90s. So he's going to share with us a whole bunch of insight and information about what it means to train for triathlons. Hope you enjoy the show. Meanwhile, be sure to click and subscribe. Simon, you have been doing endurance training, triathlons, especially since 95, or did it start before then?
No, it started before then, actually. I came back from Australia, having found out about triathlon and found out about the surf Ironman competitions they have out there where they do surf skis and paddleboarding and swimming and running on the beach. I watched a triathlon out in Australia. I think they had the World Championships there. And I thought, well, when I get back to the UK, that would be quite interesting. And then as I got back in the September, I went to work in a bar just to earn some cash. And they have a charity thing over here every year that the main TV station runs called Children in Need. So everybody raises money for charity. And they encourage people to get involved by doing little sporting events. And so I always like to be a little bit different. So I decided I was going to find a triathlon to do. Unfortunately, there was one quite near me. Otherwise, it would have been a bit embarrassing. So I did one then. That was September 1987. And that was my first one. And then I sort of dived in, literally, for real, during the winter, trained, and then started on my little triathlon journey. And it's sort of still going in some format today.
Just curious, what is it that you love about it, first of all? I mean, I have experienced small triathlons, nothing to the state that you often do with Ironman level or Olympic level for that matter. But what is it that inspires and that the passion that drives you?
Well, at the time, triathlon was it was very, very unique at that time. You know, most people are aware of triathlon now. Certainly in the United Kingdom, over the last 10 years. Triathlons sort of hit the headlines, mostly because two brothers called the Brownlees won Olympic gold medals and silver medals, gold and bronze then at London 2012. So that was our Olympic Games. I know you've got them coming to LA again in a few years' time, haven't you? So that would be a big thing for your local athletes. But I'm based in Yorkshire, which is where the Brownlees live. They live a few miles from me. So triathlon's become a lot more popular in the last few years. But when I first started it, people didn't really know of it. And what they did know of was all really to do with the Ironman in Hawaii. So I'd seen the videos, the famous one of Julie Moss crawling towards the finish line and getting overtaken just within a couple of 100 yards of the finish, and thought, I'd love to do that race one day. And so then I set about getting some experience and sort of trying to find the pathway to get to that event, because back when I first found out about triathlon, you could enter the Ironman in Hawaii. Of course, now it's so big that you have to qualify. And it took me a few years to get there. But it was also distinctively different. So this is a phrase that my friend coined. You know, when people go to work on a Monday and they say, well, what did you do, Rocky? Oh, I played ball, I went surfing, I played golf, all the mainstream stuff. And then you say, well, I did a triathlon, actually, just did a triathlon. Wow, that's different. So I like to do things differently. I thought it was a bit more of a challenge to sort of be able to competently swim, bike and run. And of course, once you get going in something, regardless of what sport is, there's a desire to improve, isn't there? Try and be better. And in triathlon, you've got a start and an end, and there's a timing clock, so you can always get better by having a faster time, although that's not always comparable. It's very difficult, isn't it, when you're surfing, to say that big wave was better than that little wave, which was in challenging conditions. But on a triathlon, you've got a stopwatch to compare things with.
Yeah, I see big wave surfing being, well, obviously very exciting for me and friends. And when I say big wave, anything 15 feet or larger, I would consider big wave surfing. But nothing as monstrous as obviously what we see these days, an 80 to 100-foot wave. That's beyond my comfort zone. But it is an adrenaline rush. It's a little bit of pushing your limits, and I see that being similar with triathlons. But there's there's not as much pain involved typically with big wave surfing, unless, of course, a wipeout comes and you're a rag doll in the rinse cycle. But with triathlon, it's every time. What is it that drives you through that or into that pain, that world of discomfort?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I used to play rugby when I was younger, and believe me, when you get hit by a guy who's 240 pounds from the side, that's a different sort of pain. When you try to tackle that same guy, that's a different sort of pain. You know, you end up in hospital, you're getting stitched up, you've got a broken elbow or a broken collarbone or something from a big tackle. I was lucky enough never to have a serious injury playing rugby, but some of my friends did. You know, they had to have knee reconstruction surgery, and that's acute, nasty pain, isn't it? Whereas triathlon's a slow burner. You know, if you're doing what we call the standard distance triathlon, which is the distance they have in the Olympics, it's still for the majority of recreational athletes a 2.5 to 3 hour event, maybe a bit longer. So that's like doing a marathon, but we normalize that and say it's just a standard distance. When you do Ironman, you know, recreational triathletes are on the go from anywhere up from 9 hours to the best ones to 17 hours to the slowest finishers, and you're out there all day. So it's a different sort of pain. It's, you know, your legs ache, you get sunburnt, you're dehydrated, you throw up because your stomachs just can't take the gels. That's a different type of discomfort. And I do commentary, as we were talking about before, and the number of people that cross the line that you hear them talk, just say, I'm never doing that again. And yet there they are, the next race, doing it again, because I suppose it's a bit like childbirth. You know, the woman who has 3 children probably said after the first one, I'm never having another one. And then there she is with the 3 of them. Yeah, so I don't know.
So therefore, you've had 17 children, if I'm counting right. At least you're having 1 to 2 kids a year in the form of an Ironman event.
Well,
you've done some races, including the Norseman, the Inferno, one that's known as the toughest foot race on earth, the Marathon des Sables.
Yeah.
So, obviously, you are certifiable.
Yeah. I'm not normal, Rocky. That's the thing. Is in the little world I exist in, all of these conversations are perfectly normal to be talking about, you know, how many hours of training you do a week and what events you're doing and how much money you've spent on your new bike. But to any bystander, I'll tell you a funny story, actually. When I did the Inferno, I went with
Which
my
is
friend.
what? Can you explain what the Inferno is?
Yeah.
First?
So the Infernos, most triathlons are not point to point. They start and finish at the same point. So you swim out and come back and you have a transition area. Then you get on your bike and go out and come back to the transition area. Then you get your running shoes on and you run out and you come back to the finish. And the finish and start are all located in very, very close by each other. The Inferno, and the same as the Norseman, is what's known as a point to point. So you could be finishing, you know, 100 miles from where you started. So the Inferno is based in Switzerland. It starts in a valley in a lake called Thun, Thun, at the other end of a town called Interlaken, which is a really nice place to go and spend the summer. There's quite a few skiing areas around there, and you swim across the lake. And then when you come out, you've got a 90-kilometer bike ride to do. So it takes you through the hills and around Interlaken. And then you go over one of the big mountain passes called the Grosse Schneidegg. And that takes you down into a ski resort called Grindelwald. And then when you've got off your bike there, and this is a big ride, you descend down this really precarious little mountain road covered in, you know, sheep dung and wandering cows with bells and all sorts of things, and tractors and people walking. And then when you get into Grindelwald, you pick up your mountain bike and you cycle directly up the hill and you go over the Kleine Schneidegg, which is the small pass, and that's right underneath the north face of the Eiger. And if you're very lucky, you're cycling under there on a day when there's no cloud, which is very rare. But I can share a photograph with you of me just with the Eiger behind me in perfect blue sunshine. And then you cycle down the other side past the mountain ski resort, a famous ski resort in Switzerland called Wengen. Then you go up the valley a little bit and you come to the base of this other mountain called the Schilthorn. Now, I don't know if you're a James Bond fan, but The Shilthorn, at the top of the Shilthorn is a place called Piz Gloria. And Piz Gloria is when they have the ski station where in one of the early James Bonds, the Russian Rosa Klebb with the shoes that had the blades that came out of the end, she was trying to kill him. Well, that's all filmed up there. So you've been on the go for about 12 or 13 hours by now, and you run along the valley, and then you traverse up the mountainside into this little ski resort called Murren, and then you run through the town, and then you start going up the mountainside again underneath the gondolas and the ski what do you call it, the chairlift, yeah, right to the top, and then you eventually come to this precarious little ridge line, if you like, with a big drop either side. You're not going to fall off in good weather, but it looks a bit more scary than it is. And then you finish, you have to walk up about 50 steps to the finish. So that's it. And when you get to the top, you're facing just a fantastic vista. It's at sunset. You've got the Eiger, you've got the Jungfrau, and you've got the Black Monch, which are three of the biggest mountains in Switzerland, and you can see them all across the valley. It's a fabulous setting. And if you're sort of still physically capable of propping yourself up and looking across, you get this amazing viewpoint at three, and you finished at 3,000 meters, by the way. So you're at a reasonable altitude by then. But so that we stayed in Murren, which meant that after we'd finished the race, we only had to come down on the ski lift, and we were back at our little hotel. So on the evening, a couple of evenings before, this little valley, by the way, is a U-shaped valley, which means the sides are really absolutely vertical, and there's a lot of base jumping there. So base jumping is where parachutists throw themselves off an exit point off the mountain, not out of a plane. They just throw themselves off. They free fall down, and then they land in the valley. There's also some paragliders there who run down with their inflatable parachutes, and they sort of steer themselves down. And base jumping is a highly dangerous sport. And so we were watching these guys, and they'd collected their parachutes and packed them up, and they met some of the friends that were the parascenders, and then we were there waiting with our mountain bikes to go up in the lift, and then there's this family of four, the mother and father and the two teenage children, and they could all speak English, and so there was about 10 or 12 of us in this big gondola, and we said to the guys there, what are you guys doing? Oh yeah, we're going to do some base jumping. We're just going to go off that point there that you can just see by the trees, and we're going to jump down. And I'm like, wow. And what about you guys? Well, we're going parascending, so we're going to run down the slope and take off. And what about you guys? Well, we're doing a triathlon tomorrow, so we're going to start in Lake Toon, and we're going to come all the way over here, and we're going to finish on top of this mountain. We're going up now, and the paragliders were looking at the base at us, and the base jumpers looking at us saying, "You guys are mad," and we're looking at the base jumpers saying, "You guys are mad." And in the corner, there's his family of people just sort of stood there, completely still, looking at all of us, thinking, "You're all mad." Yeah, but in our world, you see, we're all completely normal.
Oh yes, yeah, exactly. So I want to get into, that's a great story. I love that. But I want to get into how do you train the insane, I guess is what I'll say, training the insane. How do you take somebody who is willing to go through everything you've just explained and get them to the point where they are doing either traditional level of competition or Ironman? What are your first steps? And kind of take me through that process, if you don't mind.
Of course. Well, the first thing, Rocky, is you need to find out when somebody wants to do this. I have a full questionnaire that somebody would fill in. So let's say that you've approached me and you've said, Simon, I want to do the triathlon in San Diego, right? You might want to do Escape from Alcatraz in San Francisco or something. So you come along to me, you've got this goal. You might want to do it to raise money for your friend's charity, or you might want to do it because you're turning 60 soon and it's a big goal that you've got, whatever. I have a full comprehensive questionnaire. I'm really concerned now with the people. When I first started doing triathlon, it took me 8 years to build up to do my first Ironman, and I went through the different distances of races, sort of elevating myself to a bit more of a challenge, and until I built up my fitness and my confidence. Nowadays, we get people who decide they want to do the hardest Ironman in the world as their first event, and they haven't even learned to swim yet. So I like people to have a bit of a lead into things rather than jumping straight in. But and often these are very high achieving people. So they're probably running a business. They've got 3 children. They're probably caring for elderly parents. Oh, and they've got a few spare hours. So, why not fill that with training for an Ironman? So I like to understand what their family life's like, what the stress is like in their life. Do they really have time to fit this in? Are they going to be able to start the training and get to a point where a few months down the line it just won't fit into the 24 hours in a day anymore? But let's say that they do have the time to train. Then training is a bit like a stool with 4 legs. The training is the seat on the top, but the seat on the top, when you sit on it, has to be supported by strong legs. Otherwise it'll collapse. So any training you do has to be supported by good sleep, by good nutrition, by a good balanced lifestyle in general, and by the sort of mental strength, and also the strength and conditioning, the resilience that we talked about previously, having a strong framework that's going to be able to cope with the training and resist injury. So I like people to try and find a way of making sure that they're getting good sleep, they're getting good nutrition, they're doing the strength and mobility work regularly, and they have a good balanced family life. And assuming all of those are in place, then we start to layer the training on top until we keep building a stronger support structure and a stronger building. I like to find out how many hours people can cope with each week, but really it's about how many hours they're able to commit to regularly and can recover from, because anybody can do the training. The recovery and doing the sitting down and relaxing and reading a book and going to bed early sort of seems to be a bit more challenging in sort of modern day lifestyle. So once we've done that, then really training for an endurance event requires a little bit of skill, particularly in swimming, which is where most people are challenged. You're a water baby. You love being in the water, so I guess that even if you don't consider yourself to be a good swimmer, you'd be comfortable in that environment, and that takes away a lot of anxiety. Whereas a lot of people are frightened about going in the ocean because they think of all the things that they shouldn't do. Things that have
fins and whatnot. Yeah,
things that have
all
fins
the creepy crawlies,
all of those things, and things that can have a theme tune with them. But if we can get people comfortable in the water and we can get them sort of reasonably skillful, running also has a skill element. Most people could, if they just move better. So that's something else that we've talked about, is being able to move well. Then they could do better at running. And then we need them to be comfortable and competent and have endurance on a bike. You don't need to do as much training as you think you do to finish these events. You have to be very consistent, and there's a huge part that the mind plays in all this, because your body will go to places that you don't realize it can go to, as long as you let the mind take over, and force you on. And if you had a gun to your head, you could complete far more things than you think you can. So we have to also train people to understand that if they're really determined on race day, they'll be able to drag more out of themselves than they think they can.
So how do you do that? How do you work on the mental aspect of endurance training?
Well, it's a process of confidence. I think a lot of people feel when people have been training regularly and doing things that constantly surprise them, they're confident about what they can achieve. I have the same people who miss a bit of training and suddenly lose confidence in their fitness. So getting people to train regularly is one thing. And then occasionally we include sessions that they've perhaps not done before. So maybe if they haven't run for 20 kilometers or 13 miles, we'll give them that to do one day. Maybe if they've not done a swim session that lasts for 90 minutes, we'll get them to do that. And then they've ticked off another box. Maybe if they've never ridden a century, we'll ask them to do that, an easy one. Maybe then we'll give them a harder one that's got a few hills in. And we'll get them to do progressively harder levels of triathlon, which is the whole point about building up over a number of years. So you slowly gain confidence in what you can do. And of course, that whole thing about never again is when you've crossed the finish line, you find that you've got as much energy as the event you've got for that day. So if you're doing a a standard distance triathlon, you push yourself to the limit of what you can do for 2.5 hours. When you're doing a half iron distance triathlon, it might take you 6 hours. And so you use up all of that energy. And you think, well, how can I go longer than that distance? But you spread your energy, more sparsely over that time. So it's just a gradual process of building up the fitness, building up the confidence, building up exposure to situations until you feel like you're ready to take on the challenge. And of course, Rocky, I can give you examples of swimmers. So I can give you examples of challenged athletes who've finished. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who I've now amongst challenged athletes who hasn't. I've seen Rudy Garcia Tolson, who's had no legs from the hips down. So he's got 2 prosthetic legs. He was an Paralympic champion at swimming. He's finished the Ironman in Florida. I've seen Paralympic athletes in hand cycles, in wheelchairs, people who've, had 90% third-degree burns on their body. I've seen blind people complete races of that distance. I've seen amputees of 1, 2, 3 limbs missing complete distances of that. I've seen Ricky and Dickie Hoyt, his dad pushing Ricky around in his wheelchair with cerebral palsy finishing. There isn't a Paralympic athlete I think you could list of some category who hasn't finished an event now. And so if I could take an able-bodied person and say, you see that person there? They've got every reason to think they can't do that, but they've done it. So there's no reason why you can't if you have the desire and the belief.
Yeah, and I imagine your coaching has evolved. It's matured. You've found things that worked and then dropped away the things that weren't working as well. It has been this constant journey of being the most effective coach you can be since you began this in 1995. So here we are 30 some odd years later, and so are close to it, coming up on 30 in just a couple of years here. What are some of those things? What are some of those elements that you are holding on to today as a means of coaching? And what did you once use that you no longer do?
Great question. Like the traffic light system, what have I stopped doing? What have I started doing, eh?
Yeah.
So I think that when I was younger, and so I've got a great quote that I use from the founder of LinkedIn, who said, if you're not embarrassed about the first version of yourself or your product or your company, then you started too late. Huh. Okay. So when I look back at the coaching I did now, when I started, I am embarrassed, hugely embarrassed with what I did, but it worked at the time. And of course, that's part of the coaching process, isn't it? As you know yourself, good coaches are always trying to improve themselves, reflecting on what they do, working out what went well and what they could do better, getting feedback from people. So I think I used to concentrate on the technical stuff and on the the swim, bike and run fitness, probably more so then. I definitely didn't pay as much attention to nutrition in depth like I do now. I certainly didn't give as much thought to sleep and recovery as I do now. I definitely didn't give any thought to, or as much thought to, people's lifestyles and stress and how that might impact on the training. I was very binary. It was like, well, if you do the training, you do it. And if you don't, well, then you're missing out. And I certainly didn't give any credence or thought to this biopsychosocial. It's like, okay, that's your genetics, that's your biology, but what's your social circle like? What are your friends like? What's that community that you exist in like? And what's happening in your brain? What's happening in your head? Is your life a chaotic mess, or are you really balanced and you just live a quiet life and you can focus on all these things? And I've come over the years, I've come to realize how important all of those things are in successful athletes. And when I think back on the people who've really maximized their potential, they've had all of those things in place, although I probably didn't realize it at the time.
So let's talk about nutrition, by the way. Now that you are focusing more on it, what are some of the elements for the listening audience who are triathletes or who train triathletes? What's your primary focus when it comes to nutrition?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is I'm agnostic about the pathway that somebody takes. All right. So, and I'll pinch a phrase from Dr. Tommy Wood. a nutritionist, who said, if somebody tells me that they're following a nutrition path and it's working for them, I can't argue with that, right? So if somebody wants to follow the vegan path or the exact opposite, the carnivore path, and it works for them, then that's great. If somebody is following a keto path and they're able to do that successfully whilst completing a lot of endurance training, then I'm not going to argue with them. That doesn't mean that I agree with those particular pathways. I do think that choosing a keto pathway while you're trying to train for an endurance event has a lot of challenges. But that's not to say that some people don't carry it off successfully. So I try to stick to some broad principles. I think, having experimented with this myself, we need to accept that endurance sports like this do require some carbohydrates, probably not as much as most people think, and probably not as much as we were told we needed to consume back in the 80s when they were saying, you need to follow you have 70% of your diet as carbs. So basically, if you're eating carbs all the time, you're going to be fine. I think we found out that's not perhaps the right path. There was you may remember the zone diet from Barry Sears, the 40, 30. Well, actually, I think there's a bit of debate now that might be a better mix of macronutrients. And but again, it's purely individual. I think we do need fats, as long as they're the right fats, and I think we do need to emphasize protein more. But you've got to be, I think, throughout all of those, if you give yourself time to plan your food intake and prepare that food, if you are in charge of the situations where you're going to be eating, so you're not eating at takeaways, you prepare your food and you take it with you rather than being a hostage to what's available and ending up with rubbish. If you stay away from processed food as much as possible, if you stay away from refined sugars, so if you're going to eat carbohydrates, I definitely would try to steer people away from too many cereals, too many processed breads, too many cakes and pastries and biscuits and chips and crisps, and onto root vegetables and those sources. And then if you prepare as much of your own food from scratch as possible, I think you probably can't go wrong with that. But also on the 90-10 principle, if you eat well 90% of the time, if you want some Dunkin' Donuts with your coffee once a week, then it's probably not going to be any detriment to you.
Yeah, you bring up another point about food preparation, and then there's training. I'm sure there's individuals out there that are triathletes who have a very balanced life, that they spend time with their significant other, and if they have children and so on. But from my perspective and from my experience, those that do compete in triathlons, they're not necessarily of that ilk. They spend so much time training and in preparation, and that it leaves very little time for anything outside of training and their career. How do you address that with your clients? Is that part of their social, their mental? Do you address that at all? Do you look at how is your life going and how much can you actually be training to achieve your goal?
Yeah, I mean, Rocky, for some people, now is not the right time to be doing an Ironman. They've got so much on that maybe now isn't the right time for them. Maybe they need to leave it a couple of years. If they've got children that are growing up that need a lot of attention, if they've just been promoted to be, the president of their company and they've got to take on a lot of new tasks and it involves a lot of socializing, maybe now isn't the right time to do that Ironman. I know a lot of people come along and say, I've set this goal for myself, I've got to do it by 40, but okay, well, what's the deadline with 40? It's just a number. If you tell me that you have been given 2 years to live and you want to do it before then yeah, I guess the clock is ticking, but the other things are just numbers driven by your ego as much as anything else. And, if your children stop speaking to you and your wife leaves you and the chairman of the company says you're not doing a very good job, does that mean it's a good time? You wouldn't want to fail on all the others just so you can succeed on this thing. So it's worth having a holistic view of life in general and working out when these are the right times. But going back to your question, if somebody's decided, and again, these are often forces of nature, these people, and once they've decided on something, they're going for it, and that's it. The ball is rolling and you can't stop it. Then I like to look at a situation and think, well, it's a continuum. You're here now, and how can we make what you're doing a little bit better? If you're going to eat food that isn't prepared by you, how can we make sure you've got better food choices? If you are going to do this with your time, how can we make sure that you're just doing a little bit better with everything? You know, life is a compromise after all, isn't it? And we have to all learn to make compromises. So maybe you have to take out a bit of a loan, a goodwill loan with your partner and your family, that you're going to be spending a lot of time here, but afterwards we're all going on a nice holiday, and I'm not going to look at my bike or my running shoes for 3 months. I'm going to spend all my time on you. Maybe you need to get the buy-in of your colleagues at work and say, look, guys, I'm going to be a bit absent for 6 months. If you can cover for me and do this and that and the other, then I'm going to return the favor when we finish this journey. So yeah, it's like spinning all those, those circus entertainers that spin the plates.
Yes.
If the plates are going to crash, then you're not doing a very good job. So you've got to find a way of spinning those plates. But there's a limit to how many plates you can spin before you start losing a few.
Yeah, and I think that also can be said for the 3 events in a triathlon. And so that makes me wonder, you've got an athlete that comes to you and who is very proficient in swimming and who's excels in cycling, but running perhaps is their weak spot. Do you create programs that you're going to expand upon their running volume and kind of for that time shrink or minimize their swim and bike? Or how does that work when you find one of those events where, and you described earlier, like swimming for the most part is most people's the weakest event, but how do you create a more wholesome athlete when you have one area that's not as highly focused as the others?
Yeah, you picked the trickiest one there, Rocky, saying if they come to me with a good swim and bike background, but actually that is a common example. And the reason it's tricky is because the statistics show that 70 to 80% of the injuries that triathletes are like to get are going to originate from running. Okay, they're not necessarily going to be muscle pulls. They're more likely to be overuse injuries. So we get a lot of ituses, tendonitis in the Achilles, bursitis around the knee, patella tendonitis, IT band syndrome. These are all related to running mostly, and generally they're below the knee where the injury tends to strike. It might be related to having tight hips, but it will be recognized as a tight Achilles or a plantar fascia or something. So we have to be very careful also. If somebody's got a swimming background, that means that they've probably got really flexible ankles, but maybe the ankles aren't stiff enough to withstand the running. So we have to be very careful about how much running we introduce. Maybe we introduce lots of walking, because spending time on your feet is just as important. So we can do walking and running and slowly build up the amount of running. So we have to be very careful with that. It's a lot easier if somebody comes along with a good running background and we can get more biking, because we can ease back on the running a little bit. So yeah.
It's good that you bring that up. I am glad, because with running, that's the only event out of the triathlon where you're actually dealing with massive impact against the planet. With cycling, it's just on a machine and you're grinding it out. And of course, swimming, you're in the water. So running, I could see being the most injurious, or potentially the most injurious, to what you just described. So you definitely don't want to increase their volume. So more about mechanics, is that what we're talking? More about posture and how they move, how every segment moves? Is that what you look at?
Yeah, I think so. I learned from a guy called Shane Benzie. I don't know if you've seen his book, the Lost Art of Running. But Shane says he's not a running coach; he's a movement coach, and he's of the firm belief that if we can loosen off the hip flexors so people can stand taller, they can run with their hips tall. If they can run with their shoulders back and their chest open, with that good neutral posture with their head up, so that the fascia is all tense and working in the right way, then we've got somebody moving well. So they're lifting their feet, they're picking their heels up, they're bouncing along. And once the fascia's moving well, then we can use the body's naturally elastic energy to move us forward. When you sit down all day, or you ride a bike a lot, or you swim, you get tight around the pectorals, you get tight around the hips. So you tend to look like you're sitting on a stool a little bit. And that doesn't allow the fascia to work properly. So we're having to work against the body's natural energy then to create more energy to overcome that before we can start running. So I do think that we can dial back on the actual running a little bit and focus more on movements, more on good posture. We can maybe do more running drills that allow us to do short bursts of activity without putting too much strain on. And if you're doing shorter bouts of activity, maybe up to 60 seconds, you can do that without creating too much fatigue. And fatigue is something else that, particularly in the running style, that leads to injury. So if we make sure that somebody doesn't get into that fatigue state, then they're less likely to start running badly, and then they're less likely to get injured. So there's a lot of other stuff we can do rather than just run.
And so a friend of mine here in Santa Cruz was one of the original competitors in the Hawaiian Ironman, the very first one. And as he describes it, as I understand it, it all came about from three people in different fields just saying how grueling this would be or that would be. And they said, okay, well, why don't we combine them all together and see how that is? So with that, would you, if three people came to you, one being a swimmer, another being a cyclist, and the third being a runner, which one is most likely going to be the best overall triathlete?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, going back to that original story, that was Commander John Collins. I think they were all
they were drinking.
They were military guys. They were working for the Navy, and they were out in Hawaii. And they said, right, well, let's do the Hawaii rough water swim. Then we'll do the round Hawaii bike ride, and then we'll do the Honolulu Marathon. And John Collins said, yeah, and whoever wins that can call himself an Ironman. And so they made this little figurine out of nuts and bolts, and that was the original Ironman trophy. It's a great story. And yeah, I don't know.
Okay, well, we're going to have to
honestly, it's a really difficult one. Swimmers tend to have a great engine. They tend to have built up that engine from a young age, so they've got a great cardiovascular structure. But swimmers tend to be more muscular in the upper body, and they tend not to have the sort of stiffness and resilience around the ankles or the hips that you get. So that counts against them. That counts against them in the running and the cycling. The cyclists, of course, they probably got the endurance, and they're the ones who can cope with being out there for many hours.
But they stay in a completely flexed position, and rarely do they ever extend, which is what's needed for swimming and running.
Yeah, and they've got poor upper body musculature, so that presents a challenge. The runners also have good cardiovascular structure, but again, they don't have the upper body musculature for the swimming. I mean, the model that we use for British Triathlon, which worked successfully for the Brownlees, was to find kids that could swim and run, because if they've got the technique for swimming and they've got the endurance for running, you can always teach them to ride a bike. So I'd say if you could find swimmers and runners, you're probably okay. I can't remember who it was. It wasn't Tom Warren that won the first Ironman, but I wasn't sure what those first Ironman guys really excelled at. I think most people come into triathlon being multi-sport athletes, having a bit of skill in both, and those guys tend to have more resilience as well. So
I'll have to ask my buddy. That's for sure. Yeah. So speaking of Ironman, and of course locally here we have Mark Allen, and Mark is an Ironman champion many times over. And after his first couple of experiences, he switched the way in which he was training with the help of a fellow named Phil Maffetone. And he's been on your podcast. What do you think of of that approach? And maybe give a little description to the listening audience that aren't familiar with Phil Maffetone's approach.
Okay, well, let's introduce Phil Maffetone first. He's a doctor. I think he's a doctor of physiology, works over on the East Coast. He was coaching runners. He was a physiologist, that's right. He would have runners come into his clinic and he would test them, and then he would have them running on the track, and he'd identified certain things like when their running gait, the running stride and everything was at a certain point, that would be when they were the most efficient. He was, through trial and error, he came up with this method which was slightly more effective than the 220 minus your age heart rate calculation, but his was 180 minus your age. So for me at 58, that means that if I take 58 from 180, gives me a figure of 122. Now there are some little adjustments you can make depending if you've been uninjured for 3 years, if you've been consistent with your training, you can add a few more beats on. But basically, he says whenever you're doing any training, you should keep your heart rate below that 180 minus your age figure for the majority of the time. It's a lot easier to do on the bike. When you're running, most people don't have that aerobic efficiency, and you probably end up walking more than you do running. So when Mark Allen started with Phil Maffetone, Maffetone gave him the heart rate monitor and said, okay, you've just won the Ironman in Hawaii. You've run a 240 marathon, which is 6 minutes per mile, but I'd want you to go and run around the track and see, keep your heart rate below 180 minus your age. So let's say Mark Allen was probably in his early 30s when he'd won, so it'd be somewhere in the high 140s. He had to run at a pace of around 8.5 to 9 minutes per mile, so almost 30-40% slower than he'd won his Ironman in. And he was very frustrated. And
I can imagine.
Yeah, and he was thinking, well, how can this method work for me, running slower than I'm already racing at? That's just madness. But he's stuck with it, and he's a very mindful guy, as you probably know if you've met him, and anybody who's listened to him talk about this will know that Mark's a very thoughtful and mindful guy. So he didn't just dismiss it, he carried on. And if you talk to him now, he'll say that actually helped prolong his career, because running, when you learn to run at that intensity, and slowly you become more efficient and you can go faster, but you can do it without creating huge amounts of fatigue, which means you recover faster. You don't put the muscles and the joints under so much strain. So then you build consistency. And as any endurance athlete will tell you, consistency is the real key to success. So what do I think about that? Well, Maffetone wrote a book called Everyone's an Athlete, and I bought that book. I came across it in the early 90s, around the same time as I found out about Mark Allen and that training. And I read it and thought, this is rubbish, because it goes completely against what I've always learned about training with high intensity and going hard and that. So I put the book away and didn't read it for another 20 years or so, until I read Primal Endurance by Brad Cairns and Mark Sisson. And then they're big fans of Maffetone. So I went back to read that book, and then I suddenly started to understand a bit more about this method, and I tried it myself. And I've subsequently tried it on a lot of the athletes I work with. And actually, all of those things Mark said 30 years ago are absolutely true. You get injured less, you become more consistent, you slowly build your speed back up, and ultimately you become a better athlete. So I'm a huge convert now. And what's happened since is that people like Matt Fitzgerald have written books called the 80-20 method. The 80-20 method was based on the research done by Dr. Stephen Seiler, a Texan who lives in Norway, who supported Maffetone's ideas from all those years back by piecing together the data from over 1,000 endurance athlete training diaries from all sorts of sports, right? Cross-country skiing, rowing, cycling, running, triathlon. And finding actually, when you look at the data, 90% of their training is spent at this really low intensity level, not necessarily 180 minus your age, but certainly supporting the principles, with about 10% at the really high intensity level above anaerobic threshold. So now I'm thinking, wow, they've got all these smart people, way smarter than I am, and they're all pointing towards this method of training. Maybe there is something in it. So that's when I got Maffetone on my podcast, and he's a great bloke to chat with. He's really entertaining, and some of his methods are a little extreme. He's really anti-sugar, completely. But I do think there's an awful lot of merit to the way he approaches physical training. And if you believe as a coach that helping your athletes to enjoy a long and successful and healthy life is also important, then I do think that method is worth pursuing.
Well, you've got your own method that you have compiled from a whole bunch of information over the years, and you have a tribe. You've got a few websites. Of course, simonward.co.uk is your personal website, with your triathloncoach.com being the other website. And you have people joining your tribe. Tell me about the tribe, and why did you name it such, and what's the importance of joining a tribe?
So I a few years ago, I got into online marketing, and I realized that if you just coach people one-to-one, there's a limit to how many people you can coach, how many hours there are in a day, et cetera, et cetera. And it does require, as you know, Rocky, when you're looking after people, it requires a lot of emotional energy from yourself. And there's a limit to how much time you can give. And if you're looking after your own personal health as a coach, you're limited there. And I thought there must be a better way of doing this where I can reach more people, maybe at a lower price point. So I started, I'd started creating things that I was going to sell online and doing launches. And I realized that was quite tiring doing those, selling this and selling that online. So I wanted to put it all into one package. So I created SWAT, which is, we use the letters in similar to SWAT teams in the US. So the design of the letters is very similar. It's Simon Ward Athlete Training. So that all worked out quite nicely.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got about 150 members of SWAT now. It brings them all together in the community. We've got their community Facebook page. There was about half a dozen of them at a race yesterday, and they've all been chatting on the Facebook page today about how they enjoyed it and saying hello to each other. The Facebook page is made up of newcomers, but there's been some people in there who were there when I started. So they're quite experienced and they understand how I write my program. So if somebody writes in and says, "Oh, I don't understand this, what does this mean?" It doesn't require me to be there to answer that question. Other people will do that for me. We have monthly educational workshops. So we've got another one coming up soon about hydration and fueling during races. We had one last month about strength and conditioning. I really want to help and educate and guide people along the way, and having a community like that helps me to reach more people. Than I still do one-to-one coaching, but that's far more involved and means I can coach less people. So that's really what it's about, is trying to help educate and train people and do that in the right way, if you like.
Well, we have the triathlon season just getting underway here on the West Coast for the most part, and turning into the summer and fall months. And so we've got several here on the Central Coast that are coming up. You mentioned a few of San Francisco, Escape from Alcatraz, and down in San Diego. Up and down the coast, we've got a listening audience that's very active. Maybe they're inspired to start off their triathlon training. So how do they get a hold of you? How do they acquire you as their coach? How do they join the tribe? Give us the ins and outs of that.
Well, you mentioned my website there, Rocky, simonward.co.uk. That's the first place they can go. They can just find out a little bit more about me. You were a guest on my podcast, so I'd suggest if people are part of your tribe and they want to hear about your story, then and they're listening to this now, listening to me chatter away, then maybe they want to come and listen to you chatter away and hear your backstory. So they could listen to my podcast. It's called the High Performance Human Triathlon Podcast. You can search for that on iTunes. And we've got lots of great guests on there. I've had Mark Allen and Dave Scott on a couple of times. They're both Ironman legends. We've had Phil Maffetone on there a couple of times. I've had all manner of American guests. So if they don't want to listen to an English accent, they can be more familiar with some of the people from your way. But I know your country people are often keen on the mother tongue from the UK. So we've had a lot of UK guests as well. And then if they are interested in joining my tribe, then it's they can find the little SWAT page. If they look under come and work with me on my website, they can see the page that takes them to the SWAT page, and they can find out a little bit more about that. They can even email my wife, who's my assistant as well, Bethany. She'll give them all of the details. We'll both answer their questions. We charge a monthly subscription of £50, so probably about $65 to $70 a month. It's open-ended. We don't have any restriction on how long somebody stays. So if they find out, in fact, if somebody comes along and finds out that thinks after a month they've connected with me, they've joined the tribe, they've joined the Facebook page, they've got the first glimpse of a program and it really isn't working for them, we'll give them their money back. So it's that first month is risk-free really. But equally, I've got some people who've been in that group for 5 years and they're in every year because it's just easy for them, you know.
Wonderful.
And what we also do is we grandfather people in. So whatever subscription fee they join at, they'll keep that for the lifetime of their membership. So they know it's not going to go up each year like the Netflix subscription does.
Well, I will put all the information in the description below the podcast for listening audience. And meanwhile, thank you for making this a really successful episode. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to our paths crossing, whether it be virtually or in person, somewhere in the not too distant future. So, Simon, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Rocky. Thank you for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the RockFit Files. I want to thank Simon for coming on and sharing all of his knowledge and wisdom. And be sure to tune in next week when we have another fabulous guest. In the meantime, check out all of Simon's links and his podcast as well. Fabulous content there. And tell your friends about the RockFit Files. Make sure you spread the word. We'll see you later.